Welcome back to Cryptid Mysterious. The year was 1956 when I sighted what I now know to be a Bigfoot. I was 15 years old at the time, and my father and grandfather were in their 40s and 60s respectively. Both my dad and my grandpa were framing carpenters, and their businesses was booming. In fact, on the weekends, they would take me to job sites to do cleanups, which enabled me to always have some folding money in my pocket. I should tell you that both of these men were in excellent condition physically. They were constantly carrying lumber and going up and down ladders. At this time, nails were delivered to the job site in 100-pound wooden kegs, which men used to carry by hand. I didn't give much thought to it at the time, but when I would attempt to do some of the things they did with regularity, I at 15 was unable to do so. They were strong, durable men. Both my father and grandfather were hunters, and a couple of times a year, they would head to a variety of locations to bag their next trophy. And so it was. In the early fall of 1956, we packed up the truck and headed over to Buffalo, Wyoming for some antelope hunting. At that time, according to Grandpa, Buffalo was touted as being the best place in the country for deer, elk, and antelope. As funny as this may seem, with all of my talking about hunting, our sighting actually had nothing to do with hunting at all, and I'll get to that. So, we had traveled out into the region, eventually hooked up with Highway 16, and now this highway actually runs through Buffalo and into what are known as the Bighorn Mountains. It then passes through Cody, and if you continue on, you'll end up in Yellowstone. We were heading out for 10 days, which would include some sightseeing, fishing, and the hunt. This region of Wyoming has a lot of history attached to it that's worth mentioning. There's something to be said about standing in the place where historic events have occurred, just as there is something to be said about reliving where you saw Bigfoot. At that time, the town of Buffalo couldn't have had more than a couple thousand residents, but I do remember it being very accommodating and hospitable, a place to stay. During the first couple of days, we had headed south to check out some historic sites. It wasn't like we were going to see some mountains or anything like that. Rather, we were going to several locations where events had occurred. The first was the site of the Fetterman Massacre. Most people have heard of Custer's last stand at Little Bighorn, but few, if any, even mention the name of Fetterman. On December 21st, in 1866, Captain William J. Fetterman and 81 troopers were massacred at the hands of the Indians. An alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapahoes dispatched all of the 81 men on the infamous day, and we stood there in the place where it had happened, contemplating the events of that day. We then traveled to a place where the wagon box fight had occurred on August 2nd, 1867. This happened near Fort Phil Kearny during the Red Cloud War. It was here that 6 civilians and 26 Army soldiers had created a defensive wall out of wagon boxes to fight off a band of several hundred Sioux warriors. The soldiers and civilians had been armed with the latest Henry lever-action Springfield breech loader rifles, and they fought off the Sioux for hours, losing many horses and mules that were driven away by the Indian raiders. Having been there, I can only tell you that there is a palpable energy present in these locations. When you stand there, visualizing what had occurred so many years ago, it is just an incredible experience. We then traveled into the region of the infamous Hole in the Wall Gang. They acquired the name by hanging out in Hole-in-the-Wall Pass in Johnson County, Wyoming. This was not, as it had been portrayed in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, an individual gang, but rather it was a consortium of different gangs out of the same region who all operated separately from each other, with members of different gangs occasionally teaming up with other gangs to carry out armed robberies and the like. Having spent a couple days boning up on some American history, we headed back to Buffalo and began to do some fishing. This place is home of some 600 miles of clear mountain streams. There are numerous gorgeous mountain lakes, and in particular, Lake de Smet, which was touted as being the home of the rainbow trout. And we had set up a tent on the edge of the Clear Creek, which ran through the center of town. We spent a day and night there, catching some beautiful trout and enjoying the surroundings. And the following day, my dad and grandfather had hired a guide to take us out for some antelope. Now, there were available pack horses and outfitters that you could take up into the high country, as they called it. However, our guide was bringing us in a jeep into some areas where the antelope could be found. Really, the way it worked was quite simple and less time consuming than horseback. We were riding in the jeep and stopping from time to time to scope out the surrounding terrain with binoculars in the hopes of finding our prey. Once an antelope was seen, the guide would determine if the pursuit would continue on foot, in the jeep, or both. At the end of what was 2 days, we had each bagged one, and the following day, we traveled over to High Mountain Lake, which was located in the Bighorns. This lake was like a big bowl sitting in the middle of some rocky and rough terrain. It was filled with beautiful crystal clear azure blue water. Surrounding the lake were stands of pointy tall spruce trees that were clustered together here and there. We set up our tent on a wide flat area on one end of the lake. As a matter of fact, there were actually several other people and tents set up when we arrived. So we weren't alone in this location. You could walk around the entire lake and fish from the water's edge. The three of us were getting into some really nice rock bass, perch, and rainbows. At day's end, we hiked up to an elevated position behind where our tent was set up and sat out on an outcropping of rock. From this position, we were maybe 100 feet above our camp, looking over the lake at another large outcropping, perhaps several hundred feet tall. This outcropping was protruding out of a sloping hillside, which had several large patches of spruce trees interspersed within it. It was late in the day, and as we were looking everywhere, embracing the moment and the beauty of this place, a large figure appeared from behind one of the stands of spruce. Now, the spruce trees were growing sporadically up the lower side of this outcropping, and because of their height and the fact that they were growing up the slope, they were blocking and consuming our view of a good portion of this rocky area. Whatever this figure was had walked behind this stand for a considerable distance before we actually saw it. As you could imagine, we were all pointing at and talking about what we were now seeing. It was large and black, and it was clearly walking on 2 legs, and as we focused our eyes and attention on it, we then noticed that it had something draped over its shoulders. My grandpa said, "It's carrying a damn deer." It could have kept walking along the steep rocky slope towards the other end of the lake, but it didn't. It started to walk up the steepest part of the outcropping, which was quite jagged and very steep terrain. In fact, at several points it was scaling some vertical rock wall faces, using one arm and its legs while hanging on to this animal draped over its back and shoulders We watched this beast navigate its way up through this several 100-foot tall area of loose rock and steep walls for maybe 5 minutes before it disappeared over the top. I don't have to tell you how we felt or what we were talking about for the evening. The following day, we walked around the lake into the area where we had been watching it the day before. As we were now standing where it had been, the dimensions of everything that we had been looking at suddenly became exponentially larger. The loose rocks that it had been casually walking across were 1 and 2 foot boulders flowing like sand down the face of this hillside. We could barely walk on them for fear of breaking an ankle. The jagged rock walls it had navigated with ease while carrying a deer were very formidable indeed. I was now standing, facing the wall that I had seen, and standing against it as it began to climb. I was now standing, facing a wall that I had seen it standing against as it began to climb. From the other side of the lake, I had thought this wall was maybe 10 or 15 feet tall, but now I was standing in front of it, the wall almost 30 feet tall. This beast had appeared to be almost half the wall's height when looking at it the previous day. And by the way, when this thing had been climbing the rock faces, it had been using one hand and both feet, just like my dad and grandpa would carry lumber up a ladder. My grandpa has long since passed away, but at the time, we didn't know what we were looking at. It was only years later when the term Bigfoot had begun to circulate in the States that we realized we had seen one that day in Buffalo, Wyoming. It may be the most intense and exhilarating experience that I'd ever had in my lifetime.